Before we start on our program, I think it behooves me to say something about just to remember what happened with those school children. Since this program is going to deal with violence, I suppose we now know it's in many places. I'm a Republican and was talking today to a colleague of mine who's rather high up in the Republican establishment. And even he said, this country must do something about guns, if only symbolically, because, the morale is so demoralizing to so many people. So we'll keep our fingers crossed and inshallah, something will happen. Today, we're going to talk about religion sort of at the international level. I'm a Catholic, so I think of Pope Francis. I'm not a Russian, therefore do not think about Patriarch Kirill, but they certainly have different views of the religious function. Yona, the program is yours.
Thank you very much, Don. Before we introduce our distinguished speakers, I would like to again follow up with several comments. Actually, the narrative today simply changed overnight, as you mentioned about this tragic attack, massacre in Texas. Again, I think all of us obviously will share the condolences to the families of the victims, to the community, to the entire nation, actually to the world. And of course, President Biden last night addressed the nation regarding this tragedy. And he mentioned several times the name of God, and it is the time to act. And obviously, we're getting all the time condolences and statements from leaders, the UN Secretary General, and Pope Francis, of course, expressed his condolences and time to say enough to the indiscriminate trafficking of arms and so on. And other leaders also spoke about this, from President Zelensky in the Ukraine to other leaders around the world. Of course, we'll see the impact of the massacre on developments related to that particular tragedy. So again, in connection with what we're going to discuss today, I mean, the first question that came to mind, at least following what happened yesterday in Texas, is where is God, so to speak, among the terrible tragedies of intolerance and extremism and violence, terrorism and war, and so on and so forth. Obviously, in our discussion, we will also deal with attacks on schools, children all over the world in the name of God, so to speak, whether it is the Boko Haram, Nigeria, the kidnapping of school children, or to attack pilgrims around the world. So I think, again, we must obviously link the current developments to our discussion. So one, of course, is the atrocities in school and directed against children and teachers and so on. The other issue or challenge that I think we would have to look at is the health security in terms of the COVID. as we look today at the global picture, we see that probably over 6 million people were killed or died, and in the United States, over 1 million, in many other countries around the world, from Brazil to Indonesia. So we would have to look, obviously, also at that particular tragedy. Now, if I may, I would like, again, in light of what happened yesterday in Texas and in general, related to our discussion, to mention as a context, academically or practically, some of the contributing factors that encourage intolerance and violence and terrorism and war, such as the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union and perhaps the downfall of the Arab Spring on the ethnic, the racial, the religious, tribal intolerance, violence, the escalation of propaganda, psychological warfare, extreme nationalism, separatism, original conflicts that defy easy solution, and the intensification, I think, of criminal activity, exploitation of population, and migration, expansion, unemployment, and the wide economic gap between the North and the South, environmental challenges, as well as arms development and proliferation of weapons. Now, I'm mentioning all this as a context, and also to mention again that since we're going to focus on some of the religious aspects, since it is the month of May, we try always to look at the anniversaries. And 41 years ago, on May 13, 1981, Muhammad Ali Haja from Turkey attempted to assassinate Pope Paul, John Paul II, as we know. And of course, we had other assassinations of leaders all over the world in the name of God or religion and so forth. So what I would like to do is to mention, first of all, the situation in the Ukraine, and we're going to have our speaker make a presentation in a minute. And later on, related to Africa and the Middle East and Asia, the map. And obviously, I think we would have to see what can be done in terms of the interfaith dialogue. So with that, I would like to invite first our speaker, actually the three speakers that we have now, Dr. Andrew Sorakovsky, who is an attorney, a historian, and a former editor of the journal that was produced at Harvard on Ukrainian studies. And then Professor Muhammad Fakfuri, who is director of the graduate program of Islamic Studies at the George Washington University. And third, Ahmad Javid. Ahmad, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council of South Asia Center, and formerly he was the ambassador of Afghanistan to the United Arab Emirates. We are going to have some slides of their backgrounds for your review in the interest of time. So first I would like to invite Dr. Andrew Sorokovsky to make an initial presentation, and then the other speakers, and to follow up with the discussion among the speakers and the invited audience. Andrew?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Today, I would like to briefly discuss three types of abuse of religion in the current Russo-Ukrainian war. I will then contrast them with one key aspect of religion in Ukraine. And finally, I would like to offer my view on interreligious dialogue as a way to end the war. The first type of abuse of religion I would like to mention is historical. Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia all claim descent from the medieval state known as Kievan Rus, or simply Rus, as do their churches. But today, Russia asserts that only its claim is valid. Its spokesmen deny not only the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state, but the very existence of the Ukrainian people. Moreover, they deny the legitimacy of Ukraine's independent Orthodox Church, whose origins date to the establishment of the Kievan Metropolitanate in the 11th century. The second type of abuse is propagandistic. Russian politicians claim that they are fighting a defensive war against NATO and the US, which allegedly are using Ukraine as a puppet governed by Nazis, its Jewish president being presumably the chief Nazi, and Russian churchmen justify this as a holy war against Western immorality, claiming, for instance, that Ukraine is being forced to hold gay parades. As a democratic state with freedom of speech, press, and assembly, Ukraine freely permits all kinds of parades, from gay pride to World War II Red Army veterans, everything in between. Thus, in Russia, religion is enlisted in state propaganda campaigns that are as incoherent as they are false. The third type of abuse I'd like to mention, abuse of religion, is political. For centuries, the Russian Orthodox Church has been what is sometimes called a handmaiden of the state, a servant of the state. First of Muscovy, then the Russian Empire, its successor, then the Soviet Union, and now the Russian Federation. In the 18th century, Peter the Great has abolished the Moscow Patriarchate and subjected the Russian Church to the imperial state, putting it under a government office, actually. In the 20th century, Joseph Stalin, having nearly destroyed the Russian Orthodox Church in the 1930s, revived it as an instrument of Russification at home and of Soviet foreign policy abroad. Today, Patriarch Kirill and other leading churchmen continue to publicly support an unprovoked and unjustified war in which Orthodox Christians slaughter other Orthodox Christians for no coherent reason. The Moscow Patriarchate has evidently lost its ability to speak truth to power. It has scandalized and divided the Orthodox Christian world. In fact, last night, in an interview with Greek radio and television, ERT, the ecumenical patriarch, Bartholomew, in Istanbul, said that Patriarch Kirill should oppose the war and should resign. To their credit, a number of Russian Orthodox priests have spoken out against the war, and the Moscow Patriarchate's Metropolitan in Ukraine, Onufriy, and some of his bishops have done likewise. Meanwhile, Russia continues to persecute Christian and Muslim minorities on its own territory and also in the occupied Crimea and Donbass. Ukraine's religious tradition is different. It is highly diverse. This is not only because of governmental policies in recent years. It is a result of Ukraine's complex history. It is true that this history has involved interreligious conflict and violence. We naturally remember such events, but we overlook the centuries of peaceful coexistence, comity, and cooperation. Ukraine's predecessor state of Rus was Christianized at Kyiv in the 10th century. But well before this, Jewish and Muslim, as well as Christian communities, appeared on what came to be known as the Ukrainian lands. Later, Muslim Tatars living in the Crimea for nearly 5 centuries, or lived in the Crimea for nearly 5 centuries, before the Soviet regime deported them during World War II. Welcomed back by independent Ukraine after 1991, they have now again suffered exile and persecution under renewed Russian rule. Jewish communities inhabited Ukraine for over a millennium before the Holocaust, producing eminent religious, cultural, and political leaders. They have revived and continue to cultivate their traditions. Ukraine's Orthodox Christians were divided from the 16th century between those who accepted and those who rejected union with the Roman Catholic Church. Today, both the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church flourish. Roman, that is Latin Rite Catholics, have been a small but influential presence for over 6 centuries. Various Protestant and evangelical communities were active in 19th and 20th century Ukraine and remain so in the 21st. And Ukrainian law provides very favorable conditions for their evangelical work. Despite the fact that some of its members have supported Russia's war, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate is free to fulfill its religious mission. Though many parishes and parishioners have transferred to the independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is directly under Constantinople. In independent Ukraine, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim groups cooperate in the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. Representatives of all these faiths supported the Maidan, or Revolution of Dignity, in 2014, and in Ukraine's defense against the Russian aggression that began in that year. Some would argue that a religiously monolithic society is more durable than a diverse one. But a monolithic society can also be brittle. Given tolerance and cooperation, a religiously pluralistic society is arguably more resilient. Its variety and flexibility can better absorb the shocks and strains of modernity, as well as the adversity of war. This bodes well for Ukraine's resistance to the Russian invasion and for its success as a modern society nourished by faith. Can interreligious dialogue help end the war in Ukraine? I believe there are three conditions for success. First, the parties must be committed to peace. Second, they must represent exclusively religious, not political entities. And third, they must be capable of substantially influencing the course of events. I do not believe, unfortunately, that the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate meets these criteria. Therefore, I cannot be optimistic about dialogue with it. I do believe, however, that by supporting religious groups and individuals in Russia that oppose the war, the international community could help bring about peace with justice and freedom. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your initial presentation. Obviously, it triggered a number of questions. As I indicated before, we'll come back to you. Now, again, I would like to invite our colleague, Professor Mohammed Fouri, to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind invitation. I'm going to go directly to the topic of our discussion, which is religionization of terrorism, and I also read it backward, terrorization of religion, because these two processes are hand in hand, because one leads definitely to the other. Now, religionization of terrorism did not appear overnight. It has a long background to it, and it is a natural outcome of certain fundamental changes in attitude toward religion in general, and because my concentration is meant to be more on the Islamic world in relation to Islam in particular. So, but I think religionization of terrorism itself is a consequence of something else that happened early on in sometime in the middle of 13th century in Islamic history, that the process that I call as the process of ideologization of religion. By ideologization of religion, I mean reducing Islam to the low level of a political ideology and using it for political purposes. Once religion becomes the political ideology, it can justify and legitimize any type of action, any type of behavior, including terroristic activities, without any concern for ethics, without any concern for fear of God and whatnot, even though many of these organizations, in fact, pay lip service to all these concepts and terms that we are using it. Now, the origin of this ideologization of Islam goes back to 13th century, as I said, in the person of a very prominent theologian. We know him as Ibn Taymiyyah. I'm sure you are all familiar with his work. He is, in fact, the first person who presented the most exclusivist interpretation of Islamic tradition by denying the legitimacy of interpretation of not only other traditions, but also even within Islam, to the extent that even he rejected very violently even other schools of law other than the one to which he prescribed. And therefore, this became the foundation step as in the process of ideologization of Islam as a political tool. However, this is the period that the Islamic world was still intellectually very rich and very vibrant, and therefore Ibn Taymiyyah did not receive much attention until much, much later. Interestingly, sometime from the last quarter of 19th century, but mostly in the 20th century, Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas were revived and gained popularity among certain groups who perhaps were fed up with prevailing political conditions in their own countries, that they began to consider reviving views and ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah, and therefore began to speak of political Islam. Perhaps two organizations are very much important to mention in this case. One was, of course, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood. Even though it started as a co-op, as a network of co-op, did not really claim any desire for political activity or political power initially, but later on, we know where it was driving to. In Egypt and also in Iran, we have the case of the famous Fadayan Islam, the devotees of Islam, who in fact not only proclaimed their views of Islam as a political tool, but also used terroristic activities as a means of gaining political power or gaining political attention. And in their short-lived history, they assassinated a couple of prime ministers, a court minister, a very prominent historian of the 20th century Iran, and also an attempt on the assassination of the Shah. In the time closer to our time, two people especially are very important in this process without anybody paying attention to what they said. One was, of course, Ayatollah Khomeini. He very much, as prominent that he was as a jurist, as a theologian, nonetheless, his view of Islam was very, very political, not necessarily influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah, but by messianic idea, which is very deeply rooted in the Shia tradition. And in the other corner stood a more modern, contemporary, intellectual, French-educated Dr. Shariati, who in fact very much spoke of Islam as a political ideology. But these are some of the examples that in fact paved the way for religionization of terrorism. Along with this, certain developments also took place within the composition of religious and clerical communities. While until the mid-1950s, it was mostly a few very highly acknowledged leaders, both in the Sunni world and the Shiite world, that attracted attention, and their words became the religious law of any land that they talk about. Toward the end of the 20th century, and mostly in our time, we have witnessed the process of change in the composition of religious community, from highly acknowledged and accomplished scholars to very low echelons of the clerical community, who most of them, in fact, do not have much more knowledge of, at best, a high school student in religious studies. And for the same reason, with the weakening of the higher echelons of scholars of religion, then we see a bunch of non-clerical, non-religious scholars or activists step in. So we have a process of transformation of a spokespersonship for religion from theologians and scholars, from ulama to engineers. Remember, of the 13 people who were involved in destruction of the Twin Towers in New York, 13 of them were graduates of the schools of engineering. And therefore, these are the process that, in fact, accelerated the radicalization of the lower echelons of the clerical community. And at the same time, of course, they claimed that they had some legitimate concerns and grievances, being marginalized, being frustrated of prevailing conditions, being attacked by foreign and especially Western culture, or physical invasion of foreign forces and so on. And therefore, all of these, in fact, resulted in the change of definition and nature of terrorism. Now, while in the 1960s and 70s perhaps, while most terroristic activities were carried on by the so-called vanguard groups, most of the time on the model of either Cuba or Che Guevara as a model, or Algeria at best, mostly led by disillusioned intellectuals leaning mostly toward the left, who use terroristic activities as tactics in order to send messages to the establishment and also attract the attention of power. These were non-state actors, and their objectives were mostly secular: liberation, democratic institutions and governments, end to colonial dominance, economic justice, gender equality, rule of law, equality of all followers of all religions, and whatnot. But sometime in the 1970s, with the radicalization of clergy, both in the Shia world and Sunni world, we see this process begins to change. And therefore, with the changing composition of religious community leaders and activists, we see the nature of terroristic organizations also begin to change. From individual selective acts of terrorism, now terroristic activities become strategy. No longer they are tactics, they are used as strategy, and they are mass-based, very violent, appealing to the religious belief of the masses, who always express their grievances in religious terms. A great deal of grievances, which were purely economic or political, cultural or social, found expression in religious terms. And this is actually what takes place in most parts of the Islamic world in most of the time. And the objective of these new groups was not bringing democracy or democratic institutions, but to establish what they call the real Islamic government, the real government of God. And therefore, they came up with appeals to a much, much wider population than the terroristic groups of the 1960s or 70s. Now, if you analyze the declarations of, say, Ikhwan or other groups in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, many of their calls are reminiscent of some of the declarations of the 1917, pre-1917 and post-1917 revolution in the Soviet Union. If they were saying that proletariat of the world unite, now they are calling, they may not phrase it exactly the same way, they are calling Muslims of the world unite, or Shiites of the world unite. And we see this quite often, whether spoken in the same term or not, but in practice, it is what they appeal to the masses. And in addition to that, there is no talk of the nation, of the people, fatherland, or anything else to sacrifice one's life for. But all of these are replaced with one slogan: kill in the name of God, so to speak. And this is what we see quite often. Now, of course, there are very profound consequences of the religionization of terrorism. Obviously, this would lead, if it hasn't already, in some places we see already, it has led to disintegration of authority and legitimacy, a great amount of anarchy, instability, destruction of the religious base of the people's faith. Many people, and this is so interesting to hear, perhaps I'm pretty sure many of you have heard that as late as 2 weeks ago, a visitor from Jeddah told me that even in the city of Jeddah, many people, especially young people, no longer perform daily prayer. And Friday prayers are almost dead, except old people and some shopkeepers and so on. Similar reports I hear from Iran, from Turkey, which I'm in contact with more actively, from Pakistan, the same way. So these are all consequences of religionization of terrorism. But the net result of all of these is that religion and politics, when they mix together, they corrupt each other very, very quickly. And therefore, this is the situation that we see, whether one likes to hear that or not, but nonetheless, it's a reality that we see all over the Islamic world, in some places more, in some places less. But nonetheless, it is everywhere, it is there. And this is what I say, the religionization of terrorism ultimately will result in the terrorization of religion itself. Now, the question here that the panel raises is, can interfaith effort dampen the passion for conflict and violence? My answer to this is not one, but three. The first answer is yes. Here, there are two dimensions to this question. One is theoretical. If one wants to seek answer to this question in the Quran or tradition of the Prophet, there are many injunctions and guidelines as to attitude toward followers of other religions or attitude toward followers of Islam with different mindset or different types of interpretation. There's plenty of evidence in the Quran and tradition of the Prophet that shows this. But the point is that who is in charge of interpretation of these injunctions at the time that we live? You know, one of the reasons that Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism survived in the Islamic world for 14 centuries. In fact, one of the oldest churches is still functioning in Iran, in northwestern Azerbaijan. Or outside Jerusalem, the largest Jewish community was in Persia. The reason was precisely because those principles and guidelines were taken very seriously. But now, what is happening today? Not only Jews and Christians are attacked in a city of Cairo, which has always been famous for tolerance and acceptance of other traditions. And then, of course, situation is much worse in other places. Therefore, theoretically, yes, it is possible that interfaith dialogue can, in fact, dampen the desire for violence. But again, it depends who this dialogue takes place with. The other part of my answer is no. And for this reason, I can say those who present themselves as potential addressee or partner in a dialogue like that are neither scholars of religion, nor do they understand the spirit of religion, and especially the spirit of Islam. A religion whose name is identified and translated as peace. When Muslims see each other first, they say, you all know, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. How could a religion whose name starts with a statement of peace could act so violently? And therefore, for this category of people, Islam is a very dry, primitive religion. The only thing which is important in it is jurisprudence. And even in jurisprudence, a bunch of do's and don'ts without consideration for the context of one's action or without explanations that are available in the Quran and tradition of the Prophet, and therefore very, very textual. One of the reasons they commit acts of violence is precisely because of their textual reading of the Quran and tradition of the Prophet. And therefore, wherever we see they act, they are committing terrible crimes that even with the most violent standard are not imaginable. Beheading or cutting the limbs of somebody who stole a loaf of bread and things like that. And therefore, yes, with this group of people, no matter what you do, what kind of tolerance or acceptance or respect you show, it is absolutely impossible to get through because their mindset is shaped in a very, very different way. The most important element is that they believe they have the key for absolute truth, and only they have the key for absolute truth, and everybody else is wrong, and therefore there is no reason to talk to them. And that is why, despite the fact that there are so many pieces of evidence in the Quran and tradition of the Prophet to the authenticity of revealed religions, they go around and easily call Christians and Jews and Shias and Sufis as kafir, infidel, non-believers, and whatnot, and kill them because of that kind of judgment. Now, the third part of my answer is we don't know. We don't know is if interfaith dialogue would in fact dampen the desire for violence, because there are more than one or two players in such a dialogue. On the level of intellectuals or religious scholars, it is not so difficult. And in fact, in the last 25 years, there has been so many different kinds of activities and organizations and efforts to bring about dialogue between Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Muslims and whatnot. The least activity actually has been within each religion itself. There has not been much effort to bring, say, Shia Sunni dialogue or other denominations in Christianity and whatnot. But all of these efforts were on the level of religious scholars or intellectuals or activists at best. With all the good intention, they have never been or rarely been translated into political action. And that is why it is like a vicious circle. Despite all the good intentions, we still see the same kind of crimes being committed by this group or that group, and therefore there is no way to imagine an end to this as long as other actors who are involved are brought in any interfaith dialogue. Now, nobody is asking, of course, you know what I mean by other actors, other players. I'm talking about outside forces, outside government, Western or Islamic, that have a great deal of role to play in the process of religionization of terrorism. Nobody is asking where Taliban was receiving so much sophisticated weapon system, or Al-Qaeda, the same thing, where they were training, who was financing them. These are the questions that in any interfaith dialogue have to be answered in order to make interfaith dialogue a meaningful and meaningful effort, an effort that would lead, in fact, to tangible results, an effort that could reduce not only the tension, but also result in meaningful discussion to come to an end, to bring an end to all this killing and violence that we see, unfortunately, growing and spreading even more every single day in every Muslim country. We don't probably always hear much about this, but nonetheless, if you read between the lines of newspapers and daily publications and so on, it is not difficult to detect that there is much, much more going on than what we read in official newspapers or official media. And therefore, with these three options or three answers for this one question, I think religious scholars, intellectuals must expand the scope of their activities and bring in politicians, because it is they who can make a decision and put the goodwill and recommendations of these interfaith dialogue groups into action, into tangible policies. Otherwise, we are going to continue having conferences, meetings among religious scholars and intellectuals without really any tangible results. And at the end, we would say, you are in our thoughts and prayer. Thoughts and prayer really don't do much to stop violence of any kind, including what we observed, witnessed in Texas the other day. Thank you very much. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for your presentation. Again, you raised many important questions, particularly in a practical way, in terms of the interfaith effort. And we'll come back to you after the other presentations. So now we would like to invite Ambassador Javed Ahmad to make his presentation related to his own experience as a scholar and diplomat.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Alexander. Thanks to Professor Wallace and the Potomac Institute, of course, for having me. It's great to be here. Unfortunately, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll speak from my notes. Our two esteemed professors spoke very compellingly about the broader historical and structural aspects of the religionization of terrorism or the terrorization of religion. So from my part, I will try to speak a little bit about how this phenomena or epiphenomena is seen from the perspective of a practitioner. Now, I'll make a few observations about the broader militant and terrorism landscape, as well as the ecosystem of terrorism and its relationship with the ideology or belief or religion-driven actions, and maybe say a few words about the shifting nature of terrorism challenge in the broader context of America in retreat, quote unquote, as witnessed today, unfortunately, in a post-American Afghanistan, and how perhaps that has strengthened the ideology-inspired state and non-state terror activities. So first, let me start by saying that I come from a region, South Asia region, and in that region, the fundamental challenge with respect to terrorism and the proliferation of these jihadist enterprises and jihadist franchises remains to be definitional. And I say this that why this is definitional issue, because as someone who comes from a country, Afghanistan, where terror groups today are in the country's leadership and also hold senior roles in the Afghanistan's governing ranks. These are the very groups and these are the very elements that we dealt with, and so based on our own decades-long struggle and experience with these, not just with this group, but the problem they represent, I will submit to you that the region today in the past never quite managed to reach a consensus on a common definition of what a terrorism looks like and how and to what part religion plays a role in it. We didn't do that. Unfortunately, we couldn't manage that with the immediate neighbors, and we could not manage that with the non-regional forces as well. Now, we dealt with contiguous neighbors from Iran to Pakistan, and both of whom today are arguably the region's leading sponsors of terrorism. Through their sprawling network of militant groups, their expendable forces, in which has served them quite well, to be frank, but it has also hurt them now badly as well. Now, the Pakistani establishment that we dealt with, which treated Afghanistan, for example, as a half state, mastered the use of militancy and jihadi terrorism as a cheaper and expendable force with, of course, plausible deniability. Now, they believed and they imposed upon us that the Pakistani enemy should be Afghanistan's enemy, but not the other way around. Now, even though Pakistan today and their establishment realizes that, and so does the Iranian and other non-regional forces, that in the end of the day, you cannot find perhaps a better Muslim than an Afghan, but they cleverly managed to mainstream extremist groups, militant groups, extremist religious parties, and they effectively commercialized this, jihadi militancy to fight for their own very perverse version of what I will call commercial Islam. So if a state or a non-state actor doesn't recognize the fact that what they're doing is in fact terrorism or terrorism-like, then how could you change their internal political or military calculus towards you as a state, towards you as a government, towards you as a people? So for us, it was a Herculean task, but it's a task that remains largely unmitigated and under-examined as well. Now, the sad part is that, most of the regional and non-regional countries have now realized that as patrons of jihadist terrorism, it's not easy to find common ground with such groups at the end that are driven and motivated by ideology, from transnational groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS in their local offshoots in the region, to more regional ones or more indigenous ones like the Taliban themselves, as was discussed by Professor Fahouri. And so it creates a problem. And so today that problem is that there isn't much consensus or shared political or military or economic understanding, for that matter, among the regional and non-regional forces in countries on the way forward. And even if by some miracle such a shared regional understanding does develop, the undefined enemy, quote unquote, still gets a vote, even though all sides know all too well that this is an enemy who don't really believe in a vote per se. So this is a fundamental challenge for the way forward. And I think because the belief system through which these jihadist groups operate, and most importantly, stay relevant to the scene, is a fundamental wild card in their own right, which remains largely under-examined. So on the one hand, we, me, for example, from our own ivory towers here, we could develop a shared, practical, realistic formula to manage this changing threat. But then you have these vastly different ideological groups on the ground, on the other hand, who could well say, look, we don't agree with your formula, so we don't buy it. And then everything kind of comes back to square one. So we're standing, from my vantage point, as I see it, on the opposite sides of the river. Not all of these ideological groups believe in dialogue, and some of those indigenous groups that I spoke of that have shown their willingness or openness to engage in dialogue still believe that the talks and negotiations go much slower compared to the language of a gun, which works. So at the same time, they've also not socialized peace or tolerance or coexistence, religious or otherwise, among their own ranks. So I find this to be the most significant challenge, in that we're not dealing with a force of moderation, a force of modernization as well. So finding, a secret sauce to reach some kind of a compromise, which wouldn't be perfect for either side, should be in a job one for all of us to do. Now, second point is that I think several countries in the region I come from in South Asia are going through their own Arab Spring moment, as we have seen it in recent months and weeks. I think some of the democratic forces in the region believe that the United States is abandoning them, and then they are aligning with these Islamist forces, a misperception of source that remains largely unmitigated. And I think the Afghan case, the Pakistani case, as was referred to in passing, is a good and prime example. I think there are also some democratic countries in the region who are kind of straddling between keeping up with their democratic norms, but also becoming increasingly ideological and religious, perhaps in response to the local demands. I think beyond the region, we are seeing a similar feeling among Arab Gulf countries. I served in the UAE. You could say the same thing about the Saudi Arabians, for example, Egypt and others, who I think believe that the United States was embracing ideologues like, a concern that's very much prominent in the broader Persian Gulf about Iran these days, perhaps through, this renewed JCPOA discussion. And the belief there is that this embrace of ideologues is happening at the expense of their own security. So in many ways, the broader region continues to live in this kind of shadow of Cold War. They're thinking West, but they're acting East. And this kind of goes on from Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to the Gulf, the Arab and non-Arab Gulf states. And it's an important issue that remains to be tackled. The other point is that I think the region makes a very clear distinction between who their preferred partners are and who their necessary partners are. And I think what's troubling is that a growing number of countries who wants longer-term predictability in their political or military or even economic and commercial relationships and partnerships believe that Islamists can provide that predictability, that longer-term predictability in partnerships, mainly because it is these Islamists, jihadists or otherwise, but definitely, these are forces that are that have long served as the ideological siblings of those jihadist groups. But they believe that it is these very Islamists who have long maintained their relevance, politically and militarily and otherwise, who are uncompromising in their belief systems, whose fundamental cause of fighting for God, as it was discussed earlier, is unimpeachable. And in many ways, they're also quite ruthless in defense of those principles. So it's also these Islamists who have weathered all kinds of military and political pressures, who continues to command at the local level greater legitimacy and control, and who I think arguably also have a greater staying power, a tactical staying power. So if I'm a state or a non-state actor, as a preferred or as a necessary partner, these people are now seen as an attractive alternative to the status quo. Now, the best example on this one is the Taliban. Now, I can tell you that since their founding in September of 1994, the Taliban as a group, as a unit, however desperate, they've impressively maintained the ideological promise they made about 28 years ago, which was that they wanted to take over the country and they wanted to take over the political system of that country and then fundamentally remodel it to the version that they desire and that they want. And I think the broader contours of the Taliban's promise at that time, the Taliban's ideological promise at that time, were very simple. That they said that, look, we are devout Muslims who fight and we oppose corrupt leaders. And those corrupt leaders, whether they are the Afghan communists or the former communists, or whether they're the Afghan jihadi leaders who fought against the Soviets, or whether you are an educated technocrat who came from the United States or North America or Europe, from studied on a Fulbright scholarship or other scholarships, and they treated and they painted everyone with the same brush, and they also believed in, and they had that alternative vision for a new Afghanistan. And I think the Taliban's brilliance has been, just like any other militant group in that region and beyond, is that they have refused to veer off their ideological promise, this fundamental ideological promise, and they have weathered, as I said, all kinds of pressures, and they also avoided any kind of ideological compromise on their basic principles. So the remarkable consistency of this kind of ideological promise and ideological objectives really distinguish them from all other Afghan or regional political and Islamic group. And I think that's precisely why a lot of groups, militant jihadist groups, who may not have their own territory at the moment in that region, in any specific country, are increasingly romanticizing this victory narrative that if they can do it, we can do it as well. And I think at that time, the Taliban's founder understood very well that unless this basic promise was preserved, the movement, the Taliban, as a whole, as a unit, would effectively become irrelevant. So and that is where they brought in the indispensable role that religion plays, forcing that fundamental change in that country and then beyond. And so they increasingly became first, more Islamists from within, and then now they're becoming increasingly pan-Islamist because internally they have become repressive, but externally they're becoming more aggressive. And I think in many ways, and we've seen it in recent weeks and months, that they are very unapologetic in their application of their ideology, principally because they believe that, and this was said before as well by Professor, that God has entrusted them with that system, with that government, and whatever you call it, and that people have sacrificed for this narrative. So they are accountable to God, not to the people. Now, how do you argue with that? The question right now is, how do you deal with it? Mainly because of some of the things that Taliban are doing, for example, from which a lot of the other groups are getting their own inspiration. Locally, what the Taliban are doing is that they're putting together the skeleton of their new ideological, religion-driven state. And they're doing engage in three closely intertwined ideological initiatives in order to cement and solidify their rule. They are, first of all, fleshing out their state religious ideology, call it Talibanism, for example, and which is a very sort of hybrid code that informs the Taliban's worldview, in which they really see the Afghan society or the Muslim society in that broader region as a competition between godliness and worldliness. And so the Taliban believe that the Afghan society is not sufficiently Islamic, or that they're not Muslim enough. So they're using this kind of hybrid Talibanism to re-Islamize them in order to make Afghanistan and the Afghans in general great again. The second thing that they're doing is that these very rulers are burnishing their originalist religious credentials, originalist and textualist religious credentials, by essentially revalidating themselves as a vanguard for a true Islamic leadership of Afghanistan, true Islamic leadership that Afghanistan, arguably, in their view, never really had. And in this way, and in this particular respect, what they're doing is that they are following and pursuing the very approaches that other Islamist reformists, like Said Qutb, for example, which was a pioneer behind introducing violent political jihadism, or the Egypt's Hassan al-Banna, the founder of Muslim Brotherhood, or what Maududi did, for example, who founded Jamaat Islami in Pakistan and effectively introduced this notion of vanguardism to Islam, are doing. So this is how they're burnishing their religious credential, to essentially revalidate themselves that, okay, we are going to be the pioneer or vanguard for true Afghanistan Islamic leadership. And the third thing they're doing, and which is very, very important, is that they are channeling Afghan nationalism and Afghan patriotism, at times quite fake, into religious nationalism. And how they're doing this is that they're re-engineering the principles of Afghan nationalism or local nationalism to effectively comport with Islamic nationalism, because they very much believe that Afghan nationalism, based on their own history, once it's combined with the Islamic nationalism, and majority of Afghans are overwhelming majority of Afghans are Muslim, then it's going to be a deadly combo. So for the Taliban, and for all the militant groups across the board, their ideological siblings that transcends beyond the Afghan borders, this is a twilight struggle. This war or this conflict or this competition that they engaged in is increasingly civilizational. If you're a Taliban right now, which they call themselves a mujahid, it has effectively become its own ethnic group, its own ethnicity. It's a language. You're either a Taliban or you're not. And if you're not, then it's an issue in today's Afghanistan. So being a mujahid is also a qualification and a criteria for all kinds of privileges, jobs, employments, and whatnot. So I think the biggest trick that these militant jihadist group right now is playing is to effectively appeal to the mercurial streak. And what they're doing is that they want to invoke those kind of fake nationalism and patriotism and effectively weaponize it. And in many ways, if you're not playing along, they will strip that kind of Afghanness or the Pakistanness or call it any kind of ness away from you. Particularly if you disagree. So I think Each of these initiatives that the Taliban engage in right now across the board, from the hybrid ideology to the validation or revalidation of themselves as the leader, the true Islamic leaders of that country, or merging that kind of local nationalism with Islamic nationalism, has effectively served and continues to serve as force multipliers. And would bring me to my third point, my last point, which is that, so how is now this changing the ecosystem of terrorism in that region? I think there's an emerging dangerous, very dangerous blend of shifting terrorism trends, much of which is unfortunately taking place in the backdrop of America's exit from Afghanistan. We're seeing a wide variety of jihadist groups who have come together to consult, to reorganize, to decide on their future mission spaces. And we're also seeing different variants of jihadist groups, non-Afghan, who are patiently reorganizing to perhaps tactically reorient to other theaters, but of course with one foot in Afghanistan for obvious reasons, because of their very close ideological and symbiotic relationship with the Taliban or elements within the Taliban. They're, compartmented cells of all kinds of good, bad, old, new groups and armed fighters, unaffiliated fighters, fundraisers, propaganda folks, people who do recruitment, and they effectively kind of serve as a triangle that feeds off one another. And I think in this space, what's missing from public debates is a discussion on unaffiliated fighters. So if you're not a Talib, or if you're not a Pakistani Talib, or you're not Al-Qaeda or ISIS or ETIM or IMU, then you don't belong in those, but there are thousands of them who are there, and they're unaffiliated, and they've used increasingly their frequent flyer miles to travel to Afghanistan. They're pouring into that country in droves. And these are the very people who are really, really best for tactical terror partnerships, because these people are not in any kind of monogamous relationship with the Taliban. And this is something that we really, really need to play a closer attention to. And of course, on top of this, there's a web of foreign jihadists who have romanticized the Taliban's victory, and that includes Al-Qaeda. Very much so. They're still there. They're keeping a low profile. Some of them, they're Central Asian militants that are, starting to kind of become a bit more anxious and concerned about what the Taliban would do, mainly because of their own counterterrorism commitments that they made with respect to some of those groups. So they're trying to see if they could actually form some of those tactical terror partnerships with other groups in order to remain relevant and continue with their cause. So the larger threat or the concern here is that how might forming these kind of tactical partnerships could well spew the new dangers of some kind of takfiri jihadism, because these groups are, ideologically quite different from one another. And that includes, of course, ISIS-K, or the ISIS local branch in Afghanistan as well, which have effectively locked horns with not just the Taliban, but also with other Salafist groups and with minority groups, unfortunately, targeting them on a repeated basis. So this is kind of the broader, outlook, not just in Afghanistan, but also on the Pakistani side, because the Pakistani Taliban have picked up their operations against the Pakistani state, and they're targeting them on a regular basis. There are multiple spin-off groups now who have come, some have come together, but others are still operating in silos, perhaps through these kind of loose transactional alliances with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K, but still have a foot in those kind of original parent organization. And then there are also kind of these, some of the groups that are, nationalist insurgencies in Pakistan, like the Baloch groups, who are asking for their own state in Balochistan province as well. So that really, really picked up. So this is kind of the overall, and I know that this went on a little longer, but the last point I wanted to make just about this is, and before we get into our discussion, is that I think broadly at the regional level, we're witnessing a disruptive change across the board. And I think which has increasingly taken over the status quo that wasn't acceptable to these people. And these people had that kind of appeal to the local population to tell them that, look, Disruptive change is required, both on the political side, but also on the military side, in order to shift the status quo to what we desire. And I think this has put the broader regional order at an inflection point, because disruption at the moment is demanded when the status quo reaches a point where it does not really produce the desired results that the people or these groups with huge militant constituency really want. And I think this type of change occurs when the status quo for certain people, certain groups gets disrupted, but it's not an isolated issue, or it's definitely part of a pattern, because we've seen it across the board. But I think, just to kind of close on this one, in that part of the world, disruptive change will define the regional context as we go forward, and that disruptive change will also inform the interaction of those countries and systems and actors with the international system, but also with the world itself. I think if you look at it analytically, the region will not be defined by mere geography after this, but by the interrelations between the chain of actions and reactions. So whether, disruptive change assumes the character of a predictable system, or it changes or mutates into something more destructive, then it's an open question at this point. How we see it is that the responses of jihadist groups will remain quite consistent in whatever they're doing, because it works. But their response will also likely become much more creative, much more multidimensional, much more simultaneous, multi-country, and of course sequential as well. So for us to be ahead of the curve, I believe our responses should be equally creative and preemptive, which I think should involve and must involve not shying away from testing old assumptions and maybe taking smart risks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Javid, for your view on the regional level. But I think obviously we would have to continue the discussion related to some interregional issues, or the role of the diaspora and so on. But from a practical point of view, I think this was most useful. If I may, as the moderator, to begin some discussion among the speakers, and let me ask the first question to Andrew in terms of your presentation, again, on a personal level, as a survivor in my family of the Second World War, including the massacre at Babi Yar, as well as the Holocaust. And my question really relates to what you mentioned about the Holocaust distortion. So the question that I have for you at this particular time is the slogan or the message of never again. Is it becoming irrelevant in the context of what's happening now in the Ukraine?
Well, I suppose one could argue it both ways. On one level, some say it's irrelevant because these atrocities repeat themselves, in always a little differently, but they repeat themselves. But I think in moral terms, the slogan is all the more important. We need to constantly be reminded of the dangers of this kind of atrocity, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. The thing that is perhaps most disturbing, of course, is how political actors can manipulate concepts like fascism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on. And how in the information war, and we are in the midst of an information war, they are able to confuse the issues or to turn them around in various ways. So, as I mentioned, the Russian leaders are presenting this war against Ukraine as a war against Nazis, and yet they actually Babin Yar in Ukrainian memorial was hit by one of their shells and damage was done. They are reliving or reviving the various myths of World War II. By myths, I do not mean, of course, something that never happened, but rather legends, popular notions about World War II. The Russians struggle against, fascist Germany, against Nazi Germany, and yet themselves using genocidal techniques, which to Ukrainians are very reminiscent of precisely what the German army did do in World War II. So there is a kind of topsy-turvy effect. You're taking notions and concepts and turning them upside down and using them against the very moral basis that engendered them. It's very discouraging the way propaganda manipulates such concepts as genocide, fascism, and so on. So yes, it's discouraging, but I think all the more reason why we should continue to say never again, because there is always hope that somehow consciousness will be raised and that people will have second thoughts before targeting ethnic or religious groups. I think one encouraging development is the internet, the ubiquity of information. We saw how the statements made by certain political leaders in Russia about the Ukrainians were preparing the ground for genocide. As we know from the history of the Holocaust, one of the ways in which the ground is prepared for the destruction of a group, whether it's ethnic, religious, or national, is caricature, demeaning, portraying. You remember the Nazi publications in the 20s and 30s depicted Jews as subhuman or semi-human or like animals almost. And that was preparing the ideological and psychological ground for German soldiers then to go out and destroy Jews, because if they are dehumanized in their imaginations, they can be treated as subhuman. We saw similar statements by Russian politicians about Ukrainians, about, very demeaning kinds of phrases were used. And sure enough, a few weeks later, you have situations like what happened in Bucha or Mariupol, where there was mass killing of civilians. If we learn about the techniques of genocide, if we learn more about manipulation of stereotypes, ethnic and religious stereotypes, and if we disseminate that information through the internet, through information space, perhaps there will be less inclination to repeat these atrocities. Let's hope so.
Thank you very much for your response at this point. I would like to ask Professor Fakhouri in regard to his presentation that I think the point you made related to the encourage the interfaith relationship by bringing politicians to explore various actions in a concrete way. And my question to you is, for example, efforts that are being made at this time, for example, this month in May, just the gathering in Saudi Arabia that was initiated by the government of Saudi Arabia to bring in diplomats and scholars to discuss some interfaith relationships. Was this a useful, I think, activity or useless? The same thing relates to a event that was taking place just the past couple of days in Abu Dhabi, related to the intersection between faith and religion and technology, such as artificial intelligence models and so on. Is this something practical that we should encourage?
Well, that's a very good question. My answer to this question is that no, it is not, precisely because this is another effort to exploit the popularity of interfaith dialogue for political purposes and interests of one state who does not really have one of the best records of human rights and tolerance and acceptance of others. How can one speak of understanding dialogue of different religions when one within its own territory does not respect the basic minimum rights of human beings? And it is not just Saudi Arabia. Some other Persian Gulf states also are doing the same thing for other reasons, out of the fear of Iran or something like that. Or within Iran also there are efforts for other considerations. I think any effort to bring in any kind of government institutions or politicians should take place in a very neutral environment. In a neutral environment where there is vested interest in interfaith dialogue and implementation of whatever comes out of it in practical political steps. And this cannot be done in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or United Arab Emirates for that matter, because there has to be a democratic culture of dialogue deeply rooted in the history of that particular nation or country or government. None of these governments or territories that we are talking about have that deeply rooted democratic discourse and dialogue. And especially in modern time, more so in the name of national interest and whatnot. So, but in regard to issues that Ambassador Ahmad raised, I have a couple comments, and one is, this is actually more addressed to Western governments and regional players as well, that the worst thing that can happen in religionization of terrorism is that terrorist organizations would conclude that terrorism pays and is rewarded. Probably the case of Taliban is the best example in our own time of a group that worked its way through daily explosions and killings and bombing mosques and schools and so on. And in their brief rule in the 1990s, we observed what kind of atrocities they committed, but they are rewarded. Now they are a government. And who does that? This is what I'm saying, what I mean by bringing in those people whose decisions make a difference in dealing with terroristic groups. And therefore, one thing is that in the Islamic world, it is very easy to destroy. People are very good in organizing, going against a government to remove the government or carry on a revolution, as we have seen quite often recently. But most of these terroristic groups, I would say, fortunately, do not have that skill to transform themselves from terroristic organizations into an efficient government. And in this case, Taliban is probably another example of a government that is doomed to failure unless once in power, it starts acting like any other governments. And then in that case, ideology and Islam, religion, and everything else would become like a superstructure. They would give lip service to it. They would keep mosques open and furnished and clean, but nonetheless, they would do whatever every other government does. And we have had examples of this quite often in recent history, in most parts of the Islamic world, in Iran in some ways, in Pakistan in some ways, in Saudi Arabia also in some ways. More recently, we see in Saudi Arabia what kind of openings takes place. Having a disco in the second holiest city of Islam. This is the kind of opening I mean. So this is one issue. And the other issue is that all these situations that evolved, whether in Afghanistan or other parts of the Islamic world that we are considering, do not take place in a vacuum. There are profound social, economic, and cultural background to these happenings. Why is it that a group like Taliban cannot take power in Austria or in Germany or in other places? Precisely, one of the things that interfaith dialogue groups can in fact address is to address legitimate grievances in these countries that in fact pave the way to show that some groups like Taliban are savior. They are going to bring the best life for them and so on and so forth, which will not. They do not have the know-how, and their mindset does not allow to behave other than the way they are accustomed to behave. And therefore, I myself, following developments in Afghanistan, I see what kind of reactions Afghan people are showing, and heroically, and especially the Afghan women. And therefore, we are not talking about the behavior of Taliban in a vacuum. The nation of Afghanistan is a very smart, very intelligent, and at the same time, very orthodox, religiously speaking. But they're intelligent, and therefore, they can't buy whatever that Taliban are trying to sell in the name of Islam as Islamic. Now, they may choose to remain quiet or inactive for a short while, but I don't think in the long term, unless Taliban transforms itself, which in that case is no longer Taliban. See.
Okay, Ambassador Javid, would you like to respond to that?
Oh, no, of course. I could not agree more. You're absolutely right, Professor, that so much easier to damage and to destroy than to build. And we saw it firsthand while kind of dealing with this very kind of perverse group that unfortunately now, leads Afghanistan and, effectively condemned the broader segment of the Afghan society, including women that you spoke of, to life in prison. But if you look at it kind of from a more broader perspective, the techniques and the tactics employed by groups like that, or even countries that have historically served as their patrons and continues to be, will change. I think it will also become much more creative. It will range from anything subversion and sabotage, where the goal is not necessarily going to be victory per se, but the prevention of orderly changes to those internal systems, including on the militant side. There will be kind of the subversion will become a tactic to prevent orderly changes to asymmetric warfare or even terrorism, which will involve targeting civilians, public places, and institutions. And I think this will provide largely, at least here in capitals, like in Western capitals, the breaking news. My concern is that the field of contention will be defined by the emerging ecosystem of relationship between not just states, but also the networks of these jihadists, vastly different ideological groups. So we need to kind of look at it as an ecosystem, and that's very important. on the interfaith, I couldn't agree more. The interfaith, interreligious dialogues are, seminal. It's critical to lessening the desires for violence. But we're also operating, as Professor Muhammad just said, we're also operating in some ways in vacuum. There are challenges to those engaging in elaborate, longer-term, consistent, ineffective, meaningfully effective interfaith dialogues in discussion. I think from my vantage point, what I see is missing is that one is there's a clear absence of key interlocutors between the two or multiple sides. I haven't seen a discussion where recently, and I come from that country where mullahs and imams are basically priding themselves with being the good Muslims. We haven't seen those kind of dialogues happening between them and other religious groups in that region, including in India, or with churches or with monasteries. So the other problem is that no one can speak for them, as it was discussed. No one can speak for them or on their behalf but themselves. And I think, if I'm, for example, a Talib, I wouldn't allow anyone else to speak for me in a meaningful way. But also no sane Afghan will speak for them as well or on their behalf in any meaningful way, including in platforms like this. So the problem here is that the Taliban, or groups like the Taliban, political or otherwise, they are promoting their own, perverse version of commercial Islam, mainly because they own it and they, treat it as their brand, a brand that have elevated them to the victory stage effectively. The second thing is, and I think this is the second challenge on the interfaith dialogue, is how I see it, is that our own engagement on a country level with the clerical class of these countries is negligible and at times quite limited or even non-existent. And when was the last time we dealt with the Taliban very, very closely? The United States or groups like that, it was really hard for them to go and sit with the more kind of ideologically pure, in their view, Taliban leaders. But we sat with their so-called pragmatists because they saw that we could potentially reach some kind of a compromise or, a political solution. So in this case, we need to diversify our outreaches to, perhaps, learn from some of these people as to what they're thinking, how they deliberate, how they arrive at decisions, and that, or what they see as as points of compromise that could be discussed. So that's the other one is that we're missing counter narratives and alternative narratives from our end. I'm speaking as a Muslim here, which one that could coalesce or unite the broader segment of society around. They have that narrative and they have that remarkable consistency in sticking to that narrative, and they've done it. Our narratives have consistently changed, so we need to have that narrative, in order to kind of unite the broader segment of the society on, and in a narrative that is not in clash, not with itself, but also not with the other faiths. Most importantly, moderate, functional, realistic, and practical, and that is missing. So. And lastly, I think the militant Islam, the kind of Islam that the Taliban are pursuing, is in many ways, is much more. It has much more stronger appeal, much more stronger street value among the mercurial street in that broader region. We're not talking only about Afghanistan, but talk about Pakistan. We're talking about parts of India, Central Asia as well. And because, again, it's disruptive. It's disruptive because it opposes any moderate status quo, and that includes moderate Islam. So perhaps, I don't want to kind of sound contentious here, and Professor Muhammad would know a lot more about this, But perhaps, maybe Islam needs some kind of a Lutheran reformation of sorts. One, again, as was discussed earlier, one that emerges from within, one that's indigenous, and one that's, consistent in its approaches and application.
Thank you for your response. I wonder, Professor Don Wallace, would you like to make a statement, to ask a question?
Thank you, Yona, because I'd like to speak for about 3 hours to respond to everything that's been said.
Please go. You have all the
I'm not going to, but I'll take about 4 minutes. First, you're also knowledgeable, and I'm a secular person. Is there a common thread? I'm not sure. I think one word I would use is modernization. Ukraine is modernizing. Russia is slowing down in its modernization. The Middle East, I exclude Afghanistan for a moment, is thoroughly confused about where it's going on modernization. I want to return to Turkey in a moment, where I lived. Afghanistan, under the Taliban, of course, are resisting. Now, 2 further points. The withdrawal of the United States, which the ambassador mentioned. The Mexicans always say, why is the United States so near and God so far? Now, apparently in the Middle East, one would like to have the United States closer, possibly. In Turkey, I have a friend, a woman, who has written a book about Muslimism. She's a Muslim, of course. Turkey, of course, is slightly unusual. And really, she's addressing the very question that the ambassador asked. Reform of Islam, but not from mullahs, from within young individuals. How can they live in the modern world and remain pious Muslims? I think that is really the key. And please don't look to the West for any inspiration, because we are so thoroughly confused about these issues of religion versus the secular, certainly the United States, with all of its energy. People have pointed out about the United States, in some ways it's has been one of the most rational societies in history and one of the most religious. But I do think, of course, the point that was made by the ambassador, and it's been well noted, even if we're religious, we're a profoundly secular people. So to think that American diplomats can engage within their professional role with, theologically minded or religiously minded people, we're not good at it. We never have been. The West is bad. Look at Denmark and the insult to the prophet. The West will believe self-righteously that in the name of pluralism and freedom of speech, we can say whatever the hell we want. Now, a lot of Westerners don't, a lot of us don't like that anyway, but we do it. Then how can we then, that we can't understand when Muslims become violently indignant that the prophet has been made fun of? I mean, those are the kind of, so I think the answers will not come from the outside. They'll come from within inside. I've lived in Turkey. I've traveled out to Iran. I've never been to Afghanistan. I don't think I've ever been to Ukraine. I've been to Russia a lot. I think the renewal, it's not renewal. I mean, it's something different. Since the war, we've often talked about modernizing the world. I think America's been very useful, but clearly we've come up against some walls. And it has to be people like Ambassador Ahmad. I pick him because he's young. Fafouri's not as young. I'm older. Ahmad is here at the Atlantic Council. I'm a member of it. And it'll come from people such as him. They will have to internalize the balance, the Muslimism of this young woman I know at Neslihan Hanım in Turkey. I don't think we should be pessimistic, because what is modernism all about? It's really a search for individual, not a kind of American autonomy and self-righteous individualism, but it's for some effort to exercise one's personality and one's soul in a somewhat free way. I think that's a great thing, and I think it'll come. But I mean, in the Taliban, we'll just have to, they could either fall on their face, as Professor Fafouri suggests they might. I don't think they're going to change that much internally that quickly, because they're young, they're on a roll. But I think you just have to keep the faith in all these things. That's all I have to say, Yona. Thank you.
Thank you. Your 3 hours is over.
Okay.
Yeah.
May I make a comment in response to Professor Wallace's point that he made? What we are discussing actually has always been present in the Islamic world, and in our time even much more so. Islam doctrinally itself allows diversity of views. That is why there is not one single school of law. That is why there is not one single school of theology, but multiple schools of law and multiple schools of theology. But one thing that is not happening in the Islamic world is that is still in many Islamic countries, legal system, even in those that are very modern and modernized, are still going by the books and codes that were written 700-800 years ago. Therefore, that flexibility and possibility of different interpretations that was once practiced very much during the time that Islamic governments and Islamic world was at the peak of its strength is no longer there. And at that time, we have, during the 9th century, there are centers of scholarship in cities like Baghdad and Nishabur and Isfahan that hired many, many non-Muslim scholars. Maimonides was one of the most important translators in the city of Baghdad. And therefore, that kind of discourse took place. And that is why the culture became so rich. In our time, partly because many Muslim intellectuals forgot the legacy, the historical heritage that they had, and nearly all members of Islamic scholarly communities, the ulama, their mindset remained stuck in 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, and therefore a kind of intellectual stagnation dominated over the Islamic world. And some of us became so fascinated with everything that goes in the West that began to copy, mimic whatever that we were seeing in the West without realizing that many of those things, as good as they may be, they are not copyable in the context of Islamic civilization. And many of us turned back, became even more backward looking, especially in the religious community, than ever before. And the result is this intellectual and religious bankruptcy that the Islamic world is going through today. Now, whether a Luther is necessary in the Islamic world or not, well, that will take place anyway. Partly within the Islamic world itself, and partly outside of the Islamic world. There's a famous saying attributed to the Prophet saying that at the end of time, the sun will rise from the west. Now, there is a big presence of the West in the Islamic world nowadays, especially with this social media that has caused a revolution in communication. But there is also an Islamic world in the belly of the West as well. There are more Muslim intellectuals, and I'm talking about serious intellectuals, living in the West today than ever before. And these people are not indifferent to what is going on in their homeland or in the Islamic world in general. And many of their writings immediately are translated into local languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. And therefore, such a dynamic communication already has been established between the inside intellectuals and religious scholars who are living inside the Islamic world and those who are living outside the Islamic world. But it takes time to change the mindset that has been formed in 1400 years and is not willing to accept any kind of change and is totally convinced that what it says, what it knows is the absolute truth and everybody else is wrong. And imagine give gun into the hand of such a mindset, and the result will be jihadists and Taliban and whatnot. But that transformation will definitely is in the making already, and one of the reasons that we see so much tension in places like Turkey, in places like Iran, and probably Afghanistan today, is in fact deflection of that process. I was in Afghanistan upon the invitation of Mr. Abdullah when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs for a one-week conference, and I gave one talk every day on different topics such as human rights in Islam, Islam and the West, and women's rights, and so on and so forth. And they were 300 scholars, I was told, all of them coming from different provinces of Afghanistan. Every single of them, after the end of the sessions, they came to me and you know, some of them hugged me, some of them shook my hand, and they welcomed the ideas, and they said, we hope this kind of discussion continues. And these were not ordinary non-ulama people. They were imams and mujtahids, and of course, a lot of women also were there present. They cannot remain silent forever. And I'm sure they are reacting in their own way, in their own subtle Afghan way, to what the Taliban is trying to present as the genuine Islam.
Yes, please, Andrew.
I think the last two comments bring up something which I think is a theme for countries in Eastern Europe as well as for the Islamic world. And Russia and Ukraine, for example, have dealt with two questions which I think are generally applicable to other cultures. The first is, well, the general question is, what is modernism? And the two sub-questions are, does modernization mean becoming Western? And of course, Western may mean something slightly different for the Islamic world, but it does refer to Western Europe and America. And the second question is, does modernization mean secularization? And for a long time, the answer to both of those seemed to be, yes, that's what modernization means. You become like the West and you become secular. But more recently, some scholars and thinkers, certainly in Poland and Ukraine, have been saying that actually the answer to both those questions is no. There is a kind of modernization, which is not exactly Western. It obviously borrows many things from the West, but it does not imitate the West. It does not become a clone of the West, something which, of course, Russia is accusing Ukraine of doing. The Russian reaction has been the conservative reaction, which is to simply reject modernization. But as I say, some scholars have asserted that you can, within your own culture, modernize, borrow from the West, and yet still remain yourself. The more difficult question, perhaps, for us is, does Westernization have to mean secularization? Of course, I cannot speak for the Islamic world, but certainly in the churches of Ukraine, the Catholic Church, the Greek Rite Catholic Church, and certainly now the Independent Orthodox Church, the answer is that no, you can modernize and still remain religious. You can remain true to your religious traditions. It takes a great deal of creativity, but there is a kind of modernization which is not secular. Thank you.
Thank you very
Are you
much.
asking me to answer or what?
Yes. Yes. Yes, please.
Ambassador Ahmed raised his hand first. What?
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, with every process of modernization, as we understood in the Islamic world during the 19th and 20th century, there were, of course, a great deal of transfer of values associated with aspects of modernization. A degree of that is inevitable. However, modernization does not necessarily have to lead to secularization. The best example in this is Islamic history itself. When the Prophet passed away, in fact, there was a kind of de facto separation of religion from politics and everything else. Because when the community gathered around the man who became the first caliph, and asked him to perform the same dual function that the Prophet performed, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, he said, no, we can't do that. Muhammad could do it because he was a prophet, but we'll do the affairs of our state, of our community, the way our forefather taught us in the context of Islam, and let the scholars of Quran and religion do their job, interpreting the Quran and whatnot. So this is, in a sense, a de facto separation of religion from politics, and Islam allows that to do that. And we see that the rule of law the rule of the Sharia in accordance with the Quran or any school of Islamic law does not necessarily means the Islamic State. The function of Islamic State is to protect the the religious conscience of the society. Its function is not to establish a theocratic state, but a democratic state, as we call it. In other words, a state which runs in accordance with the Islamic law. And of course, Islamic law is open to interpretation. And that is, as I mentioned, there are more than 5 schools of law, has always been there. So it is therefore possible to have modernization and avoid secularization and be very, very aware and conscious of what degree of westernization is inevitable to penetrate into the Islamic culture. One example I can give about Turkey and in Iran in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a great deal of modernization took place. In Turkey, the degree of westernization mixed with that was much stronger. In the case of Iran, in the 60s and 70s, despite extensive modernization, there was a revival of interest in everything Persian and Persianized culture, including handicrafts, music, art, and whatnot. And this was exactly the reaction that I think every Muslim territory, every Muslim nation, I would say, would show in the face of modernization. We have seen that total blind imitation of the West have failed. That is why Turkey is going through what it's going today.
Thank you. Javed, you have also comment?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. I mean, on the question of modernism, look, in the Afghan context, I mean, that's what I can speak to a bit more authoritatively, is that there hasn't been any consensus, a pan-Afghan consensus on what a modernism or a modern Afghanistan should look like, or to what degree of modernization and moderation would be acceptable, more broadly speaking. Or to what degree of, or what a moderate and accepted Afghan Islam should be should look like and should be applied. And there isn't any consensus on this one, unfortunately, not among the Afghan people or their factional leadership or the Afghan religious class, including the ulamas. So in this case, unfortunately, the country, whatever kind of modernism or modernization you put in place, and we had it for the last 21 years of Western engagement, it was all reversible after 20 years. And 20 years or 21 years is a long time. So when you're our major problem or challenge is that we are a society that is a clash with itself. So how do you change that? And you spoke of, Professor Muhammad, about the ulamas. We engage ulamas, but it did not yield the kind of results that we wanted, mainly because of these kind of lack of consensus or the absence of consensus issues. And maybe that's an Afghan problem that needs to be tackled, mainly because for every 2 Afghan, you get 5 opinions, and that creates an issue. But more fundamentally, and this was spoken about in earlier comments by one of the speakers as well, is that there is a social space for these kind of ideals to take root and become normal, or the new normal. Now, in the Afghan context, we are seeing a persistent, and are struggling with a persistent competition between cultural religiosity and then modernism or modernization. And this has provided in their own way that this kind of new Talibanism with the space to exploit. And if those actions are principle-driven actions, then in a country like Afghanistan, which is a survivalist society, it works like a contagion. So today we have a baggage, our own societal baggage, where there's a broad streak of political Islamism that pervades the Afghan society, unfortunately. There's Formative education in madrasas, is routine. It continues unregulated. Thousands of madrasas across the country. Most of them operate under, accidental or reactionary mullahs and imams. There is an unnatural fascination with martyrdom. Think about that. And if you're fascinated with martyrdom, then you need somebody to find you an enemy that you can fight. And in this case, this is a societal issue. This is a problem at the Taliban level now as well, that they have those kind of people that are fascinated with martyrdom. And for them, they need to find them an enemy. But where did these people hail from? They hail from that very society. So, but in their own right, the Talibanism offers them that kind of sense of belonging with the license for direct action.
Thank you very much. The clock is ticking. We have to end it. Don, if I may just make one final comment, and then maybe you can close it, okay?
You may, Yonah.
Okay, thank you for your permission. In the spirit of interfaith relations and brotherhood, in advancing the cause of peace with justice, I recall the Serenity Prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr, a U.S. theologian. And I recall specifically when he said that God grant us the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Don, it's all yours.
Well, I can't do better than Reinhold Niebuhr, but I sort of believe in a dynamic serenity myself, Yonah. Listen, Yonah, thank you so much. I think we all want to thank you, your persistence, and you in the format that you create in these programs, which really allows our speakers to, they're encouraged to explore their own minds even as they speak. So I think this is very impressive. Yonah, just to speak to Furi, a fellow professor, Yonah will, of course, nothing exists until it is written. So all of this will be written. It'll be edited by Kevin and his colleagues in Yonah. And so we'll get a very nice glossy covered publication. But I think it's been really excellent. If what's happening in Ukraine was the occasion for this event, then we'll have to certainly thank God. Anyway, Yonah, listen, thank you very much. And thank you all. And goodbye. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much. And I hope this sort of gatherings are repeated. It's not a one-time action.
I hope so too. Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.